The date is December 13th, 1937. After a long and bloody battle, the Chinese capital of Nanjing, also known as Nanking, was lost. As Japanese troops entered the Ming Palace airfield, they were greeted with a peculiar sight. A plane with Chinese Air Force markings sat in the middle of a pond in a nose-down position, almost as if it had flown straight into the water. The Japanese seized the opportunity to use this as propaganda, claiming that they had shot down this plane. Soon, photos of this Chinese aircraft would reach as far as the US, being published in the newspapers there. In reality, the Japanese had no idea how the aircraft ended up where it was. The plane bore no battle damage, and it appeared to be in too good of a condition to have crashed into the pond. It was as if the plane had been plucked out of the sky by an unknown force and gently placed in the water. What the Japanese didn't know was that at the same time that their forces were entering Nanjing, the plane's pilot, the one who knew exactly what had happened, was on his way out of the city. It is thanks to his escape that we are able to learn about the truth behind the series of photographs taken at the Ming Palace airfield. The plane in the photo is a Spartan 7WP, a unique variant of the Spartan 7W Executive, which was introduced by the Spartan Aircraft Company in 1936. The 7W Executive was the seventh series of aircraft to be built by the company and was intended to be used as a luxury transport. Constructed of aluminum, it was a relatively small plane with a length of 8.2 meters, a height of 2.4 meters, and a wingspan of just under 12 meters. The plane could carry up to 5 people, with the cabin being accessed through a door located on the left side of the aircraft, next to the pilot's seat. Indicated by the letter W in its name, the 7W Executive was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Jr. SB, a 400 to 450 horsepower, 9-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine, which gave it a cruising speed of around 340 km per hour and a maximum speed of just under 415 km per hour. The plane's service ceiling was slightly over 7,300 meters, and it had a range of roughly 1,600 kilometers. When fully loaded with fuel and passengers, the Spartan 7W Executive weighed just under 2,000 kilograms. In addition to 2 prototypes, a total of 34 7W Executives were produced between 1936 and 1940. Although a number of 7Ws would end up with the Spanish, American, and British militaries, these planes were originally built as civilian aircraft, which were subsequently pressed into military service. However, the single example sent to China would be slightly different from the other 7Ws. The aircraft purchased by the Chinese was of the 7WP variant, the only example of that variant ever produced. The P in its name stands for photo reconnaissance, which shows that instead of being a civilian luxury transport, this aircraft's intended role was military in nature. Interestingly, the 7WP started off its life as the second Spartan Executive prototype. Completed in September of 1936, prototype number 2 closely resembled the production model 7W planes, with some of the only differences being in the propeller and landing gear. Many sources incorrectly suggest that the second prototype had the registration number X13986. This is likely due to the cover photo on the September 1936 issue of the Aero Digest magazine, which shows the original prototype, known as the 7X, on the ground, along with a second plane in the air, which has the registration number X13986 visible under the left wing. Most assume that the second aircraft is prototype number 2, and that the number painted under the wing is its registration number. However, according to the Vintage Spartan Aircraft website, one of the best sources for information on this aircraft, the photo used for the cover had actually been altered. The 2 planes are in fact the exact same aircraft, the original 7X prototype. 2 separate photos were likely put together, with the registration number being altered in one of them to give the appearance that there are 2 separate planes. In reality, the registration number of X13986 was never assigned to a Spartan Executive, and was instead used by a completely different type of aircraft. The actual registration number for prototype number 2 is unclear. In 1937, possibly in an attempt to enter the military market, the Spartan Aircraft Company would heavily modify their second executive prototype, eventually resulting in the 7WP. Its specifications were still very similar to that of the 7W, being of a similar size and using the same engine. Furthermore, features such as the landing gears had been updated so that the plane even more closely resembled the 7W. However, the center section of the airframe was modified in order to fit the photographic equipment that the plane carried, and as a result, the cabin of the 7WP only had enough room for 3 people. According to the Air Commerce Bulletin issued by the U.S. Bureau of Air Commerce, the type certificate for the Spartan 7WP was issued on June 28, 1937, and was numbered 646. The plane was assigned the serial number of 7WP1, and following its completion, it was sold to the Chinese government through the China Airmotive Company, which was founded by Allen Lonsdale Patterson in 1930 for the purpose of exporting aircraft and aviation equipment to China. The 7WP was then disassembled and shipped to China in July of 1937. Prior to being sent to China, though, the 7WP had Chinese markings applied, with nationalist roundels being painted on the wings, as well as blue and white stripes being painted on the rudder. However, it doesn't seem to have received the standard olive green paint of the Chinese Air Force, and was instead left in bare aluminum like most of the other Spartan executives. The fabric control surfaces were likely painted silver to match the color of the body. Soon after arriving in China, it was then painted in the standard olive green paint. Interestingly, when being repainted, the original US-applied markings seem to have been covered over or removed. As can be seen in the footage here taken around the summer of 1937, the rudder of the 7WP no longer has the distinctive blue and white stripes. It should be noted, though, that the unique red pattern found on the engine cowling was not painted over, however. Also evident from the footage, the plane seems to have been damaged at some point after arriving in China. In the clip, not only has the landing gear been damaged, but there is a dent on the bottom of the engine cowling, and one of the propeller blades has clearly been bent as well. It's likely that the plane experienced a hard landing, resulting in the right landing gear strut collapsing, which then caused the nose to tip forward. The fact that only a single propeller blade was bent would suggest that the engine wasn't running at the time of the accident, which may have been the cause for the hard landing. Although the exact cause of the accident is not clear, it's very possible that the plane had either run out of fuel or that the pilot had accidentally shut off the flow of fuel to the engines. The latter was a distinct possibility as well, as the design of the fuel selector on the Spartan Executive made it quite easy for an inexperienced pilot or one who was unfamiliar with the plane to accidentally turn off the flow of fuel when switching between fuel tanks. Regardless of what caused the accident, the damages to the 7WP were eventually fixed. Later on top of the olive green paint, the plane would receive all the standard markings of the Chinese Air Force, with the nationalist insignias being reapplied on the top and bottom of the wings, blue and white stripes being repainted on the rudder, as well as a white number painted on the sides of the fuselage. The number the plane received was 1309, denoting that this was the 9th aircraft of the 13th Squadron. The 13th was commanded by Li Tianmin, a first-term graduate of the Baoding Aviation Academy. When the war with Japan started, the 13th Squadron had been equipped with the American Douglas O-2MC Scout bomber. However, soon after the commencement of hostilities, they would turn over their O-2MCs to other squadrons before relocating to Nanjing to undergo training on the Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-81B medium bomber. The Spartan 7WP was likely used by the squadron for photo reconnaissance and transport. Although the plane's service history during this period isn't very clear, its final mission was quite well documented. Following the Chinese defeat at Shanghai and their failure to stem the Japanese advance along the Yangtze River, it became clear that the Chinese capital of Nanjing, or Nanking, would eventually be lost. Despite this, Chiang Kai-shek was determined not to let the city go without a fight, and in late November of 1937, put General Tang Shengzhi in charge of Nanjing's defenses. As the battle raged and people fled the city, evacuations of government officials and other VIPs were conducted, with many of them flown out of the city by planes. On December 12, 1937, the commander of the 13th Squadron, Li Tianmin, received orders for his planes to fly to Nanjing's Ming Gugong Jichang, or the Ming Palace Airfield, by 6 p.m. that evening. By this point, the decision had already been made to abandon Nanjing. Key positions around the city had already been captured by the Japanese, with some Japanese units already starting to scale the Nanjing city walls. Orders to retreat were being sent out to the defenders, and it was clear that this was the last chance to evacuate people from the city. Taking off from Nanchang at around 2 p.m. in the afternoon, a total of 7 planes from the 13th Squadron made their way towards Nanjing. Among them was the Spartan 7WP, flown by the squadron commander himself. On the way to Nanjing, however, the Spartan suffered an oil leak, forcing Li Tianmin to separate from the other planes. Landing at Jiujiang, where emergency repairs were performed, he soon took off again, bound for the Chinese capital, with the Spartan arriving over the city at around 7 p.m. Even under normal conditions, landing at the Ming Palace airfield could be considered tricky. Built in the late 1920s on the ruins of the Ming Dynasty Palace, in 1937, the airfield consisted of a single runway running southeast to northwest. The southeast end of the runway sat right beside the Nanjing city walls, next to Guanghua Gate. Trees and buildings lay just beyond the northwest end of the runway, and to the north was Zijinshan, or the Purple Mountain, the tallest mountain in the Nanjing area. The conditions on the night of December 12th were far from ideal. As Li Tianmin flew over the city, all he saw below him was darkness. The weather was hazy that day, limiting visibility and blocking out the moonlight. Blackouts around the city meant that there were next to no sources of light on the ground below either. As the airfield was an important target for Japanese bombers, all the lights there were off as well. Only a series of flares fired off in quick succession hinted towards the airfield's general direction. However, by the time the flares had stopped being fired, Li Tianmin was still unable to see anything on the ground. A few kilometers to the south of the Ming Palace airfield was another airfield, known as the 大教场机场, or Big Parade Ground Airfield, one of the largest in China at the time. Located outside of the Nanjing city walls, and with the Japanese approaching, it was in the process of being abandoned, with the defenders burning whatever they couldn't bring with them. The now burning buildings there did provide Li Tianmin with a point of reference, however. As he was somewhere over the city center, he was able to deduce that the Ming Palace airfield was somewhere between him and the flames from the Dajiaochang airfield. By pointing his nose in the direction of the burning buildings, he would essentially be flying on roughly the same heading as the runway at the Ming Palace airfield. Knowing this, Li Tianmin then decided to start descending towards the runway blindly. As he approached from the northwest, he was able to make out some flickering lights coming from within Nanjing's Central Hospital, a large multi-story building located across the street from the runway. Using the hospital as a second point of reference, he was able to determine his plane's altitude and position in relation to the runway, safely setting the Spartan down moments later. After coming to a stop close to the southeast end of the runway, Li Tianmin noticed that there were no ground crew in sight. This was problematic, as even though his plane was now on the ground, he was still unable to see anything around him due to the lack of lights. Noticing what he thought was a flashlight in the distance, he assumed that it was a signal from the ground crew directing him on where to go. Turning his plane to face the light, he slowly taxied towards that direction. As a result of not being able to see anything in front of him, he was caught completely by surprise when he suddenly felt the plane lurch downwards. Accompanied by a loud crash, the tail of the plane rose into the air, possibly as a result of him slamming on the brakes, with the nose digging into the ground and the engine quitting in the process. Bracing himself against the cabin in order to not fall forward, Li Tianmin prayed that the plane would not flip over. Luckily, it came to a stop in the nose-down position. Only when he felt water around his feet did he realize that in the darkness, he had taxied straight into a pond that had previously been used by airfield personnel for raising fish and shrimp. In his memoirs, Li Tianmin claimed that the light had come from the rear left side of the aircraft and that he turned left to face it, eventually ending up in the pond on the southeast corner of the airfield. However, based off the footage here taken by Japanese journalists a few days after the incident, the central hospital is visible to the rear right side of the aircraft, suggesting that he may have made a right turn instead, or did a 180-degree turn at the end of the runway before turning left. This makes more sense considering that the taxiway would have been located to his right-hand side if he had landed from the northwest. Evident from some of the other photos, the plane likely did end up in a corner of the airfield, with fencing being visible both in front and to the left of the aircraft. However, Li Tianmin claimed to have taxied for quite a while before the plane ended up in the water, so it's quite possible that instead of the southeast side, he actually ended up in the southwest corner. Hearing the crash, airfield personnel soon arrived at the crash site and pulled Li Tianmin out of the Spartan 7WP. Normally, the plane would likely have been salvageable since it had simply taxied into the water at low speeds. However, with the Japanese just hours away from taking over the city, the plane was simply abandoned, left in its nose-down position in the pond. As for Li Tianmin, after being pulled from the plane, he made his way to the auditorium of the Nanjing Lizhishe building. The Lizhishe was a prestigious society or association for military officers, with many of its members being graduates of the Huangpu Military Academy. The society building in Nanjing was built around 1931 at the intersection of East Zhongshan Road and Huangpu Road, placing it next to the Nanjing General Hospital, with the Central Military Academy located to the north and the main palace airfield to the south. Due to its proximity to the airfield, those who were to be evacuated by plane from Nanjing were assembled there that evening. At dawn on December 13th, those who had made it onto the evacuation lists proceeded to the airfield. Li Tianmin was assigned another plane, an old two-seat Douglas aircraft, likely a Douglas O-2 Scout bomber. Filling in the second seat was another Chinese Air Force officer, Wang Shuming. To their dismay, no matter how hard they cranked the engine, the Douglas wouldn't start. By 6:30 a.m., all the other planes had departed. When air raid sirens began to sound, Wang Shuming gave the order to abandon the plane, setting it on fire as they left so as to not leave it for the Japanese. In fact, one of these destroyed planes captured on Japanese film just days later may have been the very aircraft that the duo burnt down. Running back to the Lizhishe building, the two managed to requisition an old Ford motor car. Following Zhongshan Road, they cut across the city of Nanjing, eventually reaching Yijiangmen or Yijiang Gate, the city gate that led to the wharfs at Xiaguan. With Japanese troops already entering Nanjing, the river was the only route of escape still open for those in the city. Once at the wharf, they were eventually able to get on a ferry and reached Pukou on the opposite banks of the river that afternoon. They were likely just steps ahead of the Japanese, who would also reach Pukou later that same afternoon, completing their encirclement of the Chinese capital. From there, the two would eventually make it back to Chinese lines. While Li Tianmin managed to escape, his Spartan 7WP was left where it was and soon became sort of an attraction for the Japanese troops, with many taking photos of the plane. For propaganda purposes, the Japanese would claim that it was their aircraft that had shot down the Spartan. Eventually, the plane was pulled out of the pond and shipped back to Japan to be displayed with other captured Chinese equipment. What happened to it afterwards is unknown, although it's more than likely that it was eventually scrapped. The airfield would continue to be used for the rest of the war, both by the Japanese as well as China's collaborationist government under Wang Jingwei. It continued to see use after the end of World War II, playing an important role in the Chinese Civil War. Afterwards, however, due to the inconvenience of having an airport located in the center of a major city, it was eventually closed down. Nowadays, only a few of the airport's original buildings remain, preserved for their historical value. Li Tianmin would survive the war and in 1973 published a book about his experiences in the Chinese Air Force. It is thanks to this book that the amazing story of the Spartan 7WP's final flight was preserved for future generations. I want to give a big shout out to Mr. Jim Savage for his assistance with this video. An expert on the Spartan 7W executive and the owner of the website VintageSpartanAircrafts.com, he very kindly provided me with information and sources for my video, as well as allowed me to use photos from his website and personal collection. He is also the owner of one of the 34 original Spartan 7W executives, and his plane can be seen on his YouTube channel N17634. If you're interested in learning more about the Spartan 7W executive, I highly recommend checking out his website and channel. I have included the links in the description. So what did you think about the story on the Spartan 7WP of the Chinese Air Force? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below, and until next time, thank you for watching.